Um, Tonight we have a seminar presentation from Dr. Alastair Macdonald from the University of Aberdeen. Ali is the Mackey Lecturer in History. His research interests lie in the theme of Anglo-Scottish relations in the later Middle Ages. His first monograph, Border Bloodshed, Scotland, England at War, England and France at War, considered an understudied and underappreciated phase of Anglo-Scottish warfare that played out against the background of the 100 Years' War. His other areas of research include focus on Scotland's place in the wider world of European diplomacy and the nature and impact of war on state and society in later medieval Scotland. And focus on such themes has seen him publish a range of articles and chapters on topics such as guerrilla warfare in medieval Scotland, atrocity, the experience of the late medieval soldier, and Scottish military leadership. And his interests have also pushed on into the 15th and the 16th centuries, and so encapsulates the period considered in this afternoon's talk, which focuses on King James IV of Scotland, an examination of the extent to which he may be considered as a medieval crusader. There'll be time for questions at the end. If I can just ask everyone to make sure they keep their microphones off for the duration of the presentation, and otherwise I'll hand over to Ali.
Many thanks, Ian, for that kind introduction. I'll just try to share my PowerPoint presentation, which hopefully will happen smoothly. Very kind of you to refer to my monograph as my first monograph, Ian. Kind and optimistic. Right, so hopefully you can all see the PowerPoint slide that I've got up there. James IV, yeah, sort of tiptoeing quite far forward in time for me. I think we can be reasonably confident that that's what the man himself looked like, roughly there, in the image on the first slide. So what I've chosen to do is to speak about an aspect of the character and behaviour of James IV, King of Scots, who reigned between 1488 and 1513. Now, I wasn't entirely sure of 100% what audience to expect and how much expertise you might all have. So apologies if this proves to be impenetrably scholarly and dense, which is probably actually a bit unlikely, or more likely if it's too simplistic and flippant and glib. I apologise for that as well. So I'm trying to get some sort of balance between accessibility yet showcasing academic debate, which is really what I'm trying to focus on here. Also, for your entertainment, I've inserted a medieval joke just to liven things up. So you can look forward to that. I'll tell you when it occurs, just to be clear. So the key thing here, the key intention that I've got in this talk is to give an exercise in historiography and historical reinterpretation. And along the way, I'll try to showcase some of the ways in which I think new angles and interpretations can be found by historians, even by us medievalists, grappling with our often limited evidence and often evidence that's already been engaged with by others. However, for the non-experts out there, just briefly some essential James IV background before I get properly going. One key aspect to bear in mind is that James IV ascends the throne in 1488, and the way in which he does so, I think, is quite important. It's in rebellion against his father, James III, and the rebellion is driven by aristocratic disaffection, not really by James IV himself, who's only 14 at the time, but nonetheless, he is still involved in this process. He's a figurehead of the rebels, and he's involved in defeating his father in battle. And in the aftermath of that, his father was killed by an unknown hand. So James IV has to deal with this for the rest of his life. He comes to the throne with the blood of his father on his hands. And there might be some guilt for his complicity in his father's death, as you might imagine, and that is a feature for the rest of his life. And I think that is the case, that he feels that. There's James III in that image, also from the Trinity altarpiece, late 15th century. So James IV is on the right hand side, and James III is on the right hand side, and his son James IV is lurking behind him, possibly not with intent to kill at this stage, but lurking behind him. On the left hand side is another image of James, the future James IV. And another important thing to remember about James IV is that his reign ends in disastrous fashion at the Battle of Flodden in 1513. He invades England with a very fine Scottish army, quite a large one it seems as well, but he suffers a huge defeat in battle in northern England in 1513. James himself and much of his nobility is killed. So there's two historiographical trends to notice at this stage, I think. One is the tendency, an older tendency, to view the whole reign through the prism of this battlefield defeat at the end. So it sort of casts a shadow, a reverse shadow over the whole of James IV's reign, and some historians have sort of condemned him for the last events, condemned James's kingship for the last events that occur, this disastrous battle. But a newer historiography is almost the reverse of that, and that's sort of to discount this rather unlucky aberration at the end and embrace this great king. Oh, never mind that unlucky last couple of hours. And I'm not sure that's entirely satisfactory either. We've got to take the totality of the events and the responsibility for them into account, I think, in trying to reach a fair assessment of James IV. So one approach is dominated by the disaster at the end of the reign, and the other sort of ignores it, or largely ignores it, as far as possible. None of these things, neither of those views actually get away from the general verdict on James IV historiographically, and that is that he's a highly charismatic and highly successful king in his personal reign. Historians tend to like him. He's got that sort of that sense of being a charismatic personality. And this is partly because of new sources in James IV's reign from a Scottish point of view. They conspire to show us a vibrant, lively figure that's not always been possible for earlier kings of Scots. So detailed financial accounts survive for his reign, for instance, and we know what he spent his money on, including some rather interesting things that he spent his money on. There's also a decent number of 16th century chroniclers who are happy to tell us a colourful tale or two. So you get, again, this sense, even if we don't always trust those chroniclers, this sense of a rather colourful and in many ways attractive image of the king. So Robert Lindsay of Fitzscotty, for instance, not reliable, but does tell a good story and tells it well. So that's quite attractive to historians as well. So historians have tended to say nice things about James IV. They do either wallow in the disaster of Flodden or try to explain it away and excuse him from any generalized fault for that disaster. But those historiographical trends, I think, are worth bearing in mind at the outset. But the particular aspect of James that I want to examine today is his crusading interests and his crusading fervour, and whether, in fact, the real question is whether he was a genuinely committed crusader or not. And there's a very stark historiography on this point in the extant literature. The older view, encompassed by R.L. Mackie, was that James IV was very much a committed crusader. Mackie's biography, published in 1958, was just the culmination of a view up to that point that James had been genuinely interested in crusade. And that in turn helps to explain the central disaster of James IV's reign, Flodden, in 1513. James IV, in this reading, was an idealist, a romantic, out of his depth in the hard-headed world of early 16th century diplomacy because he had these idealistic visions. He dreamed of a great crusade to liberate Jerusalem from the Ottoman Turks. He was rubbing shoulders, though, with other wiser and more cynical international players on the European international diplomatic scene. And they exploited James IV's naivety, and they manipulated him in his international policies, which, through a series of complex steps, ended up with him finding his death in Northumberland in 1513. In particular, the papacy and Venice are seen as stringing along the king while lining him up to try and join their alliance to attack France. The French king as well, Louis XII, promises full support for James IV's crusade ambitions if only he'll help France out in its war against England. And again, that's seen as being a manipulation of the naivety of James IV. So the famous quote from Mackie, well known, is that James was a moonstruck romantic, especially in his foreign policy and in his crusading aspirations. And this was fatal in a world of cynicism, led to his demise. But the alternative interpretation, very starkly opposed to that, is Norman MacDougall's interpretation in his biography of the king, published in 1989, but also in other works as well. And there's a total change of interpretation. So for MacDougall, James IV was a highly impressive figure of monarchical authority and decision-making in the context of the early 16th century. And MacDougall attacks three intertwined historiographical trends that he thinks, all of which he thinks are wrong. He doesn't think James IV was a committed crusader at all. He's like everyone else. He sort of talks about crusade, but he's not, you know, overly tied to that concept. And he's also not naive in international affairs, as Mackie would have it. He's not outmaneuvered and a sort of a bit of a sap when it comes to international diplomacy at sea among cleverer rulers. And also, I've already referred to this one, but his reign should not be read backwards from the point of view of Flodden, that everything leads to that tragedy, and that tragedy inevitably happens and casts a shadow over everything else that James IV did. So instead, MacDougall's James IV is a clever ruler. He's as devious as any other international statesman, greatly able and adept figure. Flodden to MacDougall is a little bit of an unlucky accident, really, in an otherwise pretty unblemished record of careful statecraft and impressive kingship. Above all, James was no keener on crusade than any of his peers, according to MacDougall's verdict on things. They were all trying to deploy crusade as a cover for self-interest or as a mechanism to leverage advantage in various ways. Everyone talked about crusade, but James, like all the rest of them, wasn't really particularly serious about it. He used crusade rhetoric to achieve greater prominence for Scotland, certainly. He was interested in that, and advantage in his negotiations with other rulers. So MacDougall's line has proved extremely influential. 30 years on, it's the dominant one, I think, in relation to James IV. There's been limited debate within this, despite this polarized historiography. One rather stark image has given way to another and has been accepted more or less entirely. It's a bit of a sterile lack of debate, to be honest. I think that does crop up sometimes within Scottish historiography. The Scottish historical community is quite small. They don't like to fall out with each other, possibly. There might be only one particular expert working on one thing at a time, and their verdict becomes the accepted verdict, and then people tend not to challenge it for a while. A little bit of a tendency to be deferential, perhaps. So I'm going to be very undeferential in this particular talk, as you're probably already suspecting. So I want to dispute that current orthodoxy and sort of showcase ways in which it can be disputed, I think. Now, I don't want to argue that Flodden should be seen as inevitable and that we should use Flodden to cast a shadow over the whole reign of James IV. No, that's not my intention, nor do I want to suggest that James IV was a deluded idealist and that he was out of his depth in international affairs. Clearly, he was a very capable operator. Clearly, he could be cynical and so on. Although I think he was outmaneuvered, frankly, in the circumstances of 1513, and didn't necessarily have a particularly sort of clear strategy in mind in some of his military activities. But anyway, that's not really what I'm arguing. Instead, I'm focusing on crusade only. Do we have a dedicated, committed crusade idealist here? Now that could still go hand in hand with being a perfectly clever and capable international statesperson. It doesn't have to be contradictory. So does he just use crusade in a cynical way for his own gain, or does he have an actual genuine crusading belief? Now what MacDougall does is ties together the three things that I mentioned, the crusade issue along with his general abilities and the Flodden effect. And by tying those together, by bundling them all together, it's easier to say, well, this is rubbish and has to be pushed to one side. But by disentangling them, I think we can maybe get a clearer view on the crusade aspect in particular. So was he a cynical operator using crusade for his own purposes, or did he mean it? Did he genuinely believe and hope to advance the crusade aspirations that he seems to espouse in his reign? So I'm probably going to come up with a different conclusion you'll already be aware than the one that MacDougall reaches. And it does raise questions of how one comes up with different analysis from historical orthodoxy, especially in a medieval context, perhaps. And one can obviously find new material to help with new interpretation, to help find new interpretations. So that's one way to do it. or material that's not been applied to that particular topic. And there's potential for that, I think, with James IV, although there's not as much of that in this talk as the other approaches. One can look at the same evidence and interpret it differently, and I think I'll be doing some of that. But also, one can adopt new approaches or new contexts to try and view the issue that one is examining, and that's probably what I'm trying to do a little bit more of. So the new approaches that I'm trying to embrace are ones that aren't always dealt with in the context of political history, and that was where McDougall was coming from, although he did deal with James as a cultural figure and so on. In terms of his crusading ambitions or otherwise, he was dealing with it from a political standpoint. And I think other forms of historical inquiry can help alongside the political dimension to try and give us a more rounded view of a figure like James IV. So notably, for instance, approaches from cultural history, which haven't been applied very closely to James's case. We can look more closely at the cultural environment of his kingship and what that might tell us, or the indications that might give for his crusading leanings. Linked to that are things like symbolism and imagery. Can that help us? These things can be neglected in political studies and arguably have been in the Scottish context. International relations and diplomacy is another angle to look at that might tell us something about James IV. There's never been a detailed study, as far as I know, of Scottish diplomacy in the Middle Ages. Someone will correct me if I'm wrong on that, but amazingly, it remains a neglected angle. What does the actual conduct of diplomacy and diplomatic environment, what does that reveal about the realisticness or the genuineness of James's crusading aspirations? And the character of James IV as well, it's clearly been explored by historians, but there's been developments in how one uses character and one's approach to people's personality in trying to understand past figures and their policy behaviours and the emotional climate from which they come. And I think those things are worth trying to embrace as well. And one aspect of that is religious sentiment and religious beliefs and devotional patterns. And again, this has been looked at for James IV, but not necessarily in context particularly of assessing him as a crusader. So I'm going to rattle through some of these different aspects of James, of what might shed a little bit of new light on James IV, and then I'll conclude on where I think he stands in terms of his crusading aspirations. Okay, so the aspect of piety, I'll start with, first of all, personal piety. It's usually accepted that James IV was pious beyond the conventional norms, that he was somebody who had a strong sense of religious belief, fair enough. He's big on pilgrimage, for instance, and the image there is of James IV as a pilgrim with his patron, St. James, standing alongside him. He goes on annual pilgrimages, for instance, to Whithorn, the shrine of St. Ninian, and to Tain, St. Duthac. Neither of these are particularly easy things for him to embark on. They are at the extremes of his kingdom in the north and the southwest, and he is a very active pilgrim in that sense. In 1507, one of his pilgrimages, famously, he went to Whithorn on foot from Edinburgh in 1507, just prior to receiving a papal sword and hat, a tribute from the papacy. So it's a pretty serious commitment to pilgrimage when you're walking all the way from Edinburgh to Whithorn to undertake it. Now, of course, there's an element of holiday to all of this. I wouldn't want to deny that, an element of getting away from it all. It was rather worldly of James IV, possibly, to meet up with his mistress, Janet Kennedy, quite frequently on his trips to Tain. There's actually quite a lot of extramarital sexual activity from James IV, number of illegitimate children. Also regular payments to Janet Beararse later in the reign. I looked for an image of Janet Beararse, couldn't find one for you, sorry about that. Mind boggles with what might have emerged. What was she? Maybe an exotic dancer or something? You can have your own guess. So there's that worldly side to James IV, undoubtedly. But I don't think that a worldly persona, I don't think that a highly sexual persona should rule out genuine piety in the case of James IV. The greater you sin, the more you might quest for redemption, for instance, and the more that redemption might offer for you. And that is a key thing to think about in terms of James IV. One of these aspects of piety is, in fact, penitence, the attempt to atone for sins by contrite behaviour of various types. And I think that has got relevance to us in thinking about the Crusade angle on things. So I mentioned earlier that James IV had been involved in the death of his father, pretty heavily, in fact, and that he felt a deep guilt for this, or at least he seems to have felt a deep guilt for this. And it's seen in his vow to wear a penitential chain around his body for every day of the rest of his life, which he seems to have carried out. At least there's evidence that he did carry that out. The image there shows James's chain in the Seaton Armorial of 1591, shows James's chain on public view. It was worn actually underneath the clothing, it seems, but it shows that that chain had become a part of the iconography that is associated with the king. Other signs of his guilt, possibly, or his feelings of guilt, possibly. There's in this rather rich book of hours that was commissioned by James IV, probably to celebrate his wedding to Margaret Tudor. There's a scene of mourning for a Scottish king that you can see there, and that Scottish king is probably James III. So enshrining mourning for his father, quite possibly, in this rich artistic work that was created. So there are two markers of a very pious king in action here, pilgrimage and penitence, that we definitely see in the context of James's reign. And of course, those two things just so happen to be absolutely central to the ethos of Crusade. Crusade is couched in medieval thought as, of course, an armed pilgrimage, a military journey undertaken in the service of God. And the penitential nature of Crusade is also very pronounced. It's service to God to cleanse the believer of his sins. That's one of the powerful motivations behind it. Indeed, increasingly, as Crusade studies go on, increasingly it seems to be that the religious drives are given more prominence rather than things like material pursuits or the pursuit of glory in itself. So if you can cleanse your sins through Crusade, it's perhaps more worthwhile in spiritual terms if you have got significant sins to account for. So I think a wider embrace of the religious context of some of the piety that James has allows us to think that there are aspects of his persona that might have found Crusade to be a genuinely attractive prospect for James IV. Wider cultural world of James IV's reign. Do we have any clues here? Again, tends to be a bit distanced from the world of politics, and these things tend quite often not to be too closely intertwined. Certainly, James presided over a culturally very vibrant reign, showcasing the king's restless intellectual energy and his interest in things like medicine and dentistry to the extent that he paid subjects so that you could have a go at extracting their teeth. I'm hoping that these were rotten teeth, actually, rather than healthy ones, but there you go. This is from the financial records, so we have to assume that it really happened. He was interested in alchemy, for instance, and paid for the experiments of the French necromancer John Damian, trying to unlock the secrets of turning base metal into gold, which he didn't manage to achieve. Spoiler there, still remains elusive. And here comes a medieval joke. I have to give you advance warning of that because, as I probably tell my undergraduate students too often, medieval jokes aren't funny, so you sometimes don't know that they're coming. So John Damian also tried to fly from the walls of Stirling Castle, we are told, and he didn't manage to fly, but he fell into a sort of dung heap, and that's why he survived, which is at least he had a soft landing. But Damian explained his failure away. He had put some hen's feathers into the wings, and those had drawn him down to the midden instead of allowing him to soar upwards into the skies. So there's your medieval joke. Even funnier than the joke is the preposterous modern rendering of this event that you can see on a modern illustration there of the fearful Damien falling to earth. I'm not getting very far with Crusade on this particular section, am I? But that's the light entertainment bit. Cultural world continued. More seriously, James IV's court and culture sponsored poetry, for instance. One of the great poets is William Dunbar, and one of his poems is Done is a Battle on the Dragon Black. And this is usually taken as a meditation on Christ's resurrection, which I guess it might be. But what the poem narrates is the defeat of a dragon. And the dragon, in popular iconography of the time, stands for evil and the devil. And in worldly terms at this time, this could be seen as unbelievers, especially Islamic ones. It could be seen as the Ottoman Turks, for instance, increasingly threatening Christendom, a dragon from the east. And these are the targets, of course, of James IV's putative crusade. So it's quite easy to read that poem, I think, as court-sponsored crusade literature, which I think would be a perfectly valid way to understand that poetry. Another venue for expressing the imagery that royalty wants to put out is things like coinage, featuring iconography that the crown wants to project. One example of this is the very high status gold noble of 1513 that's pictured in the image here. On one side, the image is of St. Michael slaying a dragon. Classic crusading image, of course, St. Michael slaying a dragon. And on the other side was a resplendent ship with the Scottish royal arms. Now, I've only got one side of the gold noble. It's probably there are probably images of both sides, but I couldn't find the other side. So that's the ship side. And the motto is "Saviour, in this sign you have conquered." Religious symbolism, symbolism of battle, of conflict against a dragon. The ship is called the Michael, of which a bit more later. So the coins iconography, there's an image of St. Michael slaying a dragon on the right-hand side there. So the coins iconography has been seen as representing the war against England that occurs in that year, 1513. I don't know if that's plausible to me. It seems to me to fit better with triumphant struggle in holy war, which I don't think the war against England was necessarily being depicted as at the time. The coins iconography to me can be seen quite easily as being about crusade or as embracing a crusading message. International diplomacy and the Crusade. What about an examination of Scottish foreign policy? Does that reveal an interest, a genuine interest by James IV in Crusade? There could be lots of detail covered here. And this is where I differ really with the analysis offered by McDougall rather than just the context in which we can possibly view the reign. I disagree in how we look at specific evidence, but I'll keep that quite brief. So one plank of McDougall's argument is that all the players in Europe talked about Crusade at the time, but it didn't really mean it, or it was deployed for political purposes. Now, that doesn't really make sense to me, actually. What's the point of a cynical ploy if everyone's involved in the same cynical ploy and nobody believes in it? Well, isn't it just completely empty? Why waste all that time on the rhetoric if that's the case? And I think a glance at wider Crusader scholarship shows that there is a genuine belief in the Crusade still. It doesn't get off the ground. It doesn't necessarily achieve effectiveness in the early 16th century, but there are undoubtedly genuine moves afoot and genuine sentiments there. Not everyone. Some seem more convincing than others in their espousal of this, but they're not all frauds. James IV, who espouses this a lot, among them. Now, a telling example of this is Ferdinand of Aragon, one half of Ferdinand and Isabella, who oversaw the unification of modern Spain, more or less, by conquering the last Muslim stronghold on the peninsula, Granada, a crusade, in fact, crusading activity that achieved a successful state purpose. And he was active in the politics of the 16th century, including the events in which James IV was tied. And he was as cynical as anyone and as self-interested as anyone else. Duplicitous, scheming, untruthful, always advancing his own or Spain's or the connected Habsburg territorial interests. And there's an image of Ferdinand there. Looks like an image of me after a hefty night out, which I've not had for a long time, it has to be said. But the remarkable thing about that image is that he's got all the money in the world to get an artist to capture him at his very best. So that was what they came up with. I digress, not for the first time. He wanted his dynasty to triumph in the war zones of the early 16th century, of course, but he was still a convinced crusader and a devout Catholic, no doubt about that. He believed that it was his destiny, in fact, to lead a great crusade and conquer Jerusalem, just as James IV might well have believed that was his destiny. So much so that he refused last rites on his deathbed. He had not conquered Jerusalem yet, so he was not about to die. He was wrong in this regard. Dies without getting last rites. 3 years after James IV's death, we get a figure like that, expressing a genuine crusading and religious sentiment in those ways. So I think there's a lot of explaining away to do if you want to regard crusade as just being empty rhetoric in this era. I don't think that's true. And James IV is more rhetorical than others. He talks about it more. He's more engaged, it seems, more taken with this as a concept than many of his peers. I think we've got to take that seriously. And one particular incident is telling, of course, and a lot of the initial view of James as a committed crusader was based on this incident. Slightly complex, but the Venetian ambassador in London, Andrea Badoer, might not be pronouncing that right. Now, one of the jobs of ambassadors in this era was to collect regular reports of what's happening in international politics, especially Venetian ambassadors, actually. So he sends letters in 1510 back to Venice, saying that he'd spoken to a Scottish priest who was a prominent diplomat, and that from this source, he gathers that James IV, King of Scots, wants to put himself forward as Captain General of Venice in his as a step in his crusading ambitions. Now, that's basically the top military commander of the Venetian state. They tended to recruit outside to get the figure of their captain general. And if he was in that position, he would be perfectly positioned to advance crusading interests more broadly. Now, MacDougall trenchantly attacks this evidence. Badoer was under pressure with the Venetians, who were considering ending his diplomatic posting. He was known to consort in taverns and to be a drinker. He was making the most of this story, trying to give a big splash back to the Venetians. His Scottish source is unknown, probably just a small-time priest on the make, probably just having a few beers together in a tavern. It's all drunken gossip, basically. Unsupported tavern gossip is how MacDougall describes that. That is pretty tendentious, I think, and not very convincing. So, for instance, a diplomat whose position is under scrutiny in Venice doesn't want to send them a whole parcel of nonsense, drunken gossip. He wants to send them good material that actually has got some substance and truth in it. He wants to pass on accurate, helpful information, but also new evidence has cropped up in this situation as well. Ward there, doing archival work in Low Countries archives, found that he found out who the Scottish priest was who had spoken to Badoer in this discussion. And it wasn't a low-ranking Scottish priest who was a drinking buddy. It was Andrew Foreman, Bishop of Murray, as in James IV's foremost diplomatic expert. That's who he'd been speaking to and getting this information from. Still doesn't mean it's necessarily true, but it adds much greater weight to that fact. He was at the forefront of James IV's crusade desires, attempting to bring peace among warring powers of Christendom, using the rhetoric of crusade. He was at that game in 1512, 1513, and so on. Now, Ward doesn't make much of that. He offers the new evidence, doesn't take it much further in terms of engaging with, which was not his intention on this in this article, engaging with MacDougall's line on the crusading aspect. But I think one of the main planks for dismantling James IV's crusading credentials falls away when we look at this evidence. And there's corroborating English evidence of this as well, that again is debunked by MacDougall again in probably rather abrupt fashion. MacDougall writes with great style and tells a very good story, and it's a very, he's a stylist who gives a very plausible version, but it's an experience really in debunking unsuitable evidence for one's case while accepting anything helpful to boost one's own case. I guess we're all guilty of doing that as historians, but here's an example where it seems quite stark. So there's very strong reasons to believe that James IV, whether he intended this or not, or whether he felt it was realistic, did put out feelers to become Captain General of Venice in 1510. It may not have been realistic, but it can only have it only adds to the picture of this being somebody who's genuinely interested in crusade in these years. And again, as I've said, in James IV's diplomacy and in his diplomatic correspondence more broadly, crusade crops up again and again as being something that is of importance to him. He talks about it more than other rulers, and I think that that can be shown through the evidence. And I think crusade, real or pretended, is at the absolute heart of James's international diplomacy in the years leading up to the end of his reign. And then there's the navy. James IV made a remarkable commitment to a Scottish navy in the later years of his reign. It was by far the biggest aspect of royal expenditure in his later years. And among the vast expenditure was the new naval dockyard at Newhaven and the construction of the Great Michael, this fantastic ship that the Scots built. The greatest ship, we think, in northern waters when it was built, bigger than anything that the French or the English had, as far as we can tell. Now, what on earth is that flurry of expenditure, that flurry of vast expenditure all about? Why on earth does Scotland need to have the greatest sailing ship in northern waters? It's a very good question. To MacDougall, the answer is very obvious, and to others, it's the defence of Scotland, defence of the Scottish coast, with a particular eye on England, or more generalised piracy. But there's a problem with this, though. You don't need the biggest and most expensive ship afloat to combat pirates or to defend against England. It's not of any use in small-scale activities. It's vastly expensive to crew and to float. I mean, one huge ship is not the best use of vast expenditure in terms of combating England in a practical sense, I would argue. It can't be kept at sea very frequently or for long periods. There's a crippling expense of a 300-man crew. That staffing that in itself and paying them and paying the mariners and the soldiers is an enormous expense for the Scottish Crown. And bear in mind that the Scottish Crown still does not routinely pay land forces. You gain service of large bodies of people by the obligation to serve in the Scottish host, not by being able to pay them, or not routinely being able to pay them anyway. And I think all this is proven to some extent by the war with England that breaks out in 1513. What does the Great Michael do? It doesn't do anything particularly to help in this war against England, or to combat English naval forces in the eastern waters. That's where the great encounter at Flodden is going to be fought. You could be disrupting English supplies. It could be it could be intervening in that conflict in all sorts of ways. No, Michael and the rest of the Scottish fleet sails north instead of south to combat the English, across around the top of Scotland for quite a dangerous voyage, to the west coast to tinker around ineffectually in the Irish Sea. An attack is launched on Carlingford, but they don't even take that successfully. It zips about back and forth a little bit, goes to air, finally goes off as agreed to link up with the French fleet. But it looks to me like it's being kept safely on the margins of things. There's not nearly as much English naval power in the Western Seas, so the Scottish fleet's going to be much safer there. It's going to be safer also when it links up with the French as well, and combines operations with them. So it doesn't look to me like the Great Michael and the rest of the fleet are all that effectively deployed in an attempt to to contribute to the war effort against the English. So there's another plausible explanation, of course, for building as extravagant and expensive and grand a ship as the Great Michael, and that is that it might serve as a flagship of a great planned crusade to the east. This is the sort of ship that would do justice to that sort of venture. And again, there's a clue in the iconography. Why is this ship called the Michael? Not vastly traditional royal name for the Stuarts, for instance. It's clearly Michael the Archangel, the slayer of the dragon again, the figurehead of Crusade, a suitable name for a ship that has that purpose. should have moved to that slide slightly earlier. Some images there of again another image of St. Michael on the left-hand side by Bruegel, battling lots of evil beasts on the left-hand side, but also the image on the right-hand side, the Massacre of the Innocents, the dragon again as a symbol of evil. The Massacre of the Innocents, obviously a biblical story, and the evil soldiers who are engaged in that activity are wearing turbans, and they are guided by a dragon flag, and that image is Memling from 1480. So finally, don't know if I've been too quick through all this material, but finally we get to the Battle of Flodden itself, in view of all the things that I've been talking about. So does the killing ground of Flodden cast any further light? Is there any way in which the battlefield trauma occurred because of the crusading aspirations embedded at the heart of the king's final years? So the received wisdom and the universally accepted view is that he's a great king who actually ran a well thought out diplomatic and military operation in 1513. Bit of a blip at the end, muddy Northumbrian fields and all that sort of thing. I mean, who could expect muddy fields in Northumberland in 1513? You might have thought that was a predictable circumstance. So a lot of misfortune, a bit of being outmaneuvered by the English forces is usually admitted, but basically the image of a king who's conducted a campaign that works and makes sense in the context of attempting to combat England is the image that's usually put forward. Now, to me, the big question really is why did James IV fight the Battle of Flodden at all? A question that's not normally very carefully addressed. Not how unlucky he was, or how soggy the ground was, or whether the pikes being used by the Scots were as useful as the weapons being used by the English. None of that. It's why does he hang around in Northumberland waiting for his adversary to arrive on the scene and to then face battle with them? Getting back over the border safely does not appear to have been James IV's concern. It seems that he was happy to wait and embrace battle with Thomas Howard, Earl of Surrey, and the defensive forces brought by him. And it should be noted as well that doesn't really fighting a battle against Surrey's forces doesn't really advance any particular strategic goal, I don't think, in the context of making an effort to support the French, in the context of a successful taking of Norham Castle. MacDougall suggests he wanted to hold on to Norham Castle, hence waiting for the battle. I find it a little bit implausible that there's any particularly good strategic reasons for waiting around to offer battle. So I think James IV wanted to have a proper battle in 1513. It fits with his persona absolutely, as far as I'm concerned. He has got soaring self-confidence and pride. Honour is at stake here. There's been challenges and so on. Surrey has offered challenges, and James wants to take them up. There's the personal rivalry with Henry VIII and the wish to stress his own honour as a warrior king. But beyond all that, there could easily be a crusading angle to this. Everything we know about James IV, I've argued, and I'd suggest, is that he's a devoted advocate of the Crusade ideal in the early 15th century. The early 16th century, sorry. He wants to have European peace to fulfill that goal. But to make the most of the situation, victory in battle is what he wants. He's raided Northern England before. He's shown his prowess as a military figure doing that, but he hasn't won a battlefield encounter against the English on enemy soil. And that's what he's trying to do now. And that would indicate the prowess and the military sort of weight of somebody who could be the person to lead a great crusade to the east and to defeat the Ottoman Turks. So, conclusions then. As I've probably already laid out, but I'll just pull it all together again. I think that James IV died at Flodden Field in 1513, trying to take a step towards Jerusalem. This is one aspect of the concern with Crusade that is so dominant in his international approach in the later years of his reign. Crusade's vitally important part of his persona by now and of his policies in the later years of the reign. It goes against current orthodoxy, but I think that orthodoxy needs to be challenged and needs to be nuanced in certain ways. There's a bit of new evidence in that. There's a re-examination of old evidence, and there's an appliance of new approaches that help to come to that conclusion by my way of looking at things. The Crusade was perfect for James IV. It allows him to engage in war, and he was an enthusiast for war. I think there's plenty of evidence for that. It allows him to express his deep piety and allows him to atone for sins and gain salvation. It also allows him to make a splash on the international stage, both for himself, for his marginal kingdom, and for his dynasty, and that's something that's very important to James and to the others in the Stuart line. And unlike most of his contemporaries, when it came to Crusade rhetoric, James IV puts his money where his mouth was. He spent vast amounts of money on his fleet, far more than was supported by any sensible strategic goals of the Scottish crown. The flagship in particular achieves this huge amount of resource spent on it. So he puts his money where his mouth is, and he dies putting his body on the line as well. A crusader who never made it beyond his own kingdom. Well, he made it slightly beyond his own kingdom, but not very far. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ali. Oh, yes, and you'll see the joy of we're discovering new things that WebEx can do all the time. The little icons of applause and all the rest of it, for those who know how to do these things.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Right, so I'll just note for everyone, if you see at the bottom right-hand corner of your main screen, there should be a chat button. And if you click on that, you can then enter things into the chat facility. So can I just ask if you can put if you have a question for Ali, if you can put your name in there, and then I'll come round you all and ask you to come off mute to ask your question. That would be much appreciated. I'll start off with one. Just to give you time to find it and to enter stuff into the box. But yeah, I was going to ask Ali, I mean, are there any examples of James's crusading interest also then being taken up by those around him within the Scottish nobility or the Scottish court? I mean, obviously the argument for the 14th century with David II would be that he influences other Scottish knights and Scottish nobles to take up that cause and to take on crusading ambition. So is there any evidence of that might also help back up what you're arguing?
Good question, Ian. You're meant to ask easy ones as the chair, but there you go. I thought you were going to ask something about Janet Beararse. Not that much, to be honest. Not that much. I mean, yes. I mean, there's crusading sentiments. There's people who go out there. There's talk of it, but yeah, this one gets the feel of being royally led, really. So that he's going to lead his subjects rather than sort of saying, "Oh yes, I approve of this," and off you go and do stuff. So I think that's probably the evidence for that is limited from inspiring others to engage in it. And I view it as his view of things, his image of things being a royal enterprise and a royally led one, and that's not especially encouraging to his great nobles to go off and do it themselves.
And are there any actual activities going on at the moment? I mean, obviously the Ottoman threat is very real, but Europe has a hard job sometimes wrapping its head around that. I mean, are there actual crusading activities that James could have been involved in, or is he looking to start something himself?
Yeah, well, so he's hoping to latch on to expressed crusading fervor from others as well. Yes, but the trouble is that the wider international context is of pretty major war between the big powers, and that's partly what James is doing. He's intervening to try and bring about a reconciliation between the papacy and France, for instance, to try and stop them fighting each other. The war's raging in Italy, so it's featuring all the major players that might be involved in crusading ventures. They're talking about it, but Venice, the papacy, the Castile and Aragon under Ferdinand and Isabella, England as well, and so the people who have got potential are not really in a position to advance crusading views at this time, or crusading activities at this time. There's discussions with the King of France, for instance, about the French king saying, yes, I want to go on crusade, and James having agreement with him, if you can't for health reasons lead the crusade, then let's agree that I'll take it over for you. So that's cited in diplomatic correspondence a number of times. But yeah, there's not an awful lot going on actively. I mean, obviously there's small scale activities attempting to combat the Ottomans on the ground.
Thank you very much. Oh yes, Andy, on you go.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, good, great. Thanks for that, Ali. Really enjoyed it as ever.
Good.
Question: we were sort of talking over this. You were saying about the Great Michael and the seeking of battle as crusading. I mean, surely something like the construction of the Great Michael, there's just as much an element of, I've got a bigger one than you in this. And similarly, the sort of seeking of battle, it can be seen as an assertion of Scotland's greatness and military prowess as much as necessarily being a statement of crusading.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I agree, Andy. So where I'm trying to place both of these things is in a wider context of it looking quite convincing that crusade is important to James IV. That aspect of I've got a bigger one than you is absolutely looks very much like one of the things that's going on. But it's a very expensive way to make that particular point. The eye-watering amounts for the Scottish kingdom to be expending on that, yeah, you can read it in that way. I don't suggest that any of these things are single issue interpretations, that there's more than one thing going on here, and that's undoubtedly, if he manages to achieve his goal and does go on a crusade as I see it, then he's also saying the same thing. Look at how important I am. Look at me, I'm standing on the prow of the ship that's going to liberate Jerusalem. The military thing as well, absolutely. I think there's a bundle of sort of the acceptance of battle at Flodden. I think there's a whole bundle of things that suit his character that lead him to be willing to face battle at Flodden in 1513. I'm suggesting that crusade might be one of them. What a way to prove that you are a worthy leader in war, if you can win an actual battle, because battle in the end, it still does have that cachet, that sort of extra sense of glory that accrues to winning in battle on your enemy's soil. So I think that there's that aspect to it. I guess what I probably object to most, Andy, and you might have an opinion on this, is viewing Flodden as essentially a well-run campaign, as sort of that it's all militarily sensible. I don't mind if you say, okay, it's not about crusade, but let's not pretend that this is all about pursuing sensible and rational military objectives, because yes, I would like to get agreement that he's accepting battle for whatever reasons he thinks, right, I want to have a battle on English soil.
Thank you. Any further questions? I've got a few minutes.
Well, if I could have another.
Yeah, you got it.
We were just you were quite interested in what you're saying about some English evidence for the captain generalship of Venice, which you didn't sort of enlarge on. If you could you say anything about that, because it sounds quite interesting.
Not much, Andy, just that it exists, really, and it's not sort of very fleshed out, but there's mention of this being an aspiration of James IV, basically an English diplomatic sort of discussion and letters, but don't have my hands on the detail just now to give you anything more concrete than that.
Thanks.
If anyone's struggling with the chat facility, do feel free. You can always just jump in and I'll let you. Oh, Ian, over to you. Ian McCann. Oh, sorry. You've switched your mute off, but there's no sound coming through. No, I still can't hear. No, sorry, Ian. It's not coming through for some reason.
Do you want to type it in?
You could do, or maybe even just using the one on the computer rather than the headset might work. Happy to take any more while Ian sorts out his headphone. Lindsay?
Well, I mean, we've got to know more about Janet for goodness sake. You can't just leave us with a bill and a name. I want to know more.
I did all I could, Lindsay. You know, as I said, I searched for an image online, and you know, all sorts of things. Nothing historically accurate. I mean, that's all we've got really. It's financial records that start to reveal that sort of interesting detail. So yeah, exotic dancer, something like that. But certainly something rather salacious anyway.
Could she be a fool? 'Cause it's not. I mean, it's in there's other courts employing female.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that sounds plausible. Yes. I mean, it does sound like a sort of ribald, sort of amusing sort of role that she's got, maybe rather than anything genuinely titillating. So yeah, absolutely, could be that sort of function. Yeah, I don't know much more than that she appears in the financial records a few times. So it might be that's the sort of thing where you can, if you can pin down the context, you might be able to get a clearer image of exactly her role and what she was providing for James IV's court.
I love that it's appearing in the financial records, though. It's like claiming earbuds or expenses by MPs. Yes. Ian, Mackay, do you want to have another go? No. Okay, fine. You can take your question in if you want. Yes, Andy, you can come back in.
Actually, just to develop on what you were saying before, it does occur to me, do you think James's use of pikes on the Flodden campaign was perhaps actually a deliberate attempt to show this was now at the forefront of European military technology, and you could read that as a example of his qualification to lead an international crusade, because he's using European tactics rather than specifically Scottish.
Yeah, that's I think that's right. So I mean, there's definitely an attempt to embrace the sort of latest technology at the forefront of things, at the cutting edge. Same with the artillery. You know, a lot of money is spent on artillery as well, and obviously the artillery doesn't function as well as they had hoped at Flodden. There's lots of artillery on board the fleet as well. So again, that could have been perhaps put to better use in the circumstances of 1513. But yeah, and again, sort of, I guess my objection to elements of how that's dealt with is the idea that that James had created this sort of modern, functioning and well-drilled military machine. I'm just like, well, how is he doing that, and when does that take place? You know, we don't even know how they were trained. And if you just get lots of people carrying pikes instead of carrying the short spears they've been used to, it doesn't sound like it's actually a recipe for success. So you've got to march in step, don't you, to use these things effectively? You've got to be drilled. Exactly. And when are they doing that training in a Scottish context? I mean, the foot soldiers, let's remember, are drawn from the peasantry. I mean, they don't really, and there's pretty varied evidence about how effective Wapenshaws were, sort of, showing of weapons and sort of element of training, how effective that was, even though there's legislation about it a lot. The practical attempt of the practical aspect of how it was achieved and what it did is perhaps less fully developed. So yeah, so I wouldn't go as far as to suggest that it meant that you had a military force that was going to be as effective as the Swiss, which obviously didn't when it came down to it.
Because what you do is you hire the mercenaries to use the pikes.
Indeed. If we take as our last question, Ian's put his in the chat. He was suggesting that James seems to have blundered from one crisis to the next, and was wondering what we perhaps know about his advisors.
Well, blundered from one crisis to the next might be. I mean, I don't know if I'd go that far in characterizing it in that way. We do know who his advisors were, and we know, for instance, one thing in his defense is that this, there's involvement of the political community in all of this. There's it seems to be a really large army drawn from the entirety of the kingdom that travels across the border in 1513. There's so he's going through the proper procedures of consulting with people and finding out their views on things. Some of his prominent advisors are against it, but not many. So I think it's widely, if James is culpable for the events of 1513, he's culpable alongside the whole political establishment, I think. There's big buy-in, and it seems to be a major Scottish force that is convinced to go and campaign in northern England. One standout is the great Bishop Elphinston, founder of the University of Aberdeen, of course, who shows his wisdom in that, as in other things, by advising against the option of going to war with England in 1513 or 15 in the later years of the reign. But he's ignored. But I think, but his the fact is that he's getting a variety of advice, and Elphinston would seem to be a fairly isolated voice for not engaging in conflict. And after all, the Scots have got a bit of a habit of conflict by now. This is the old enemy. It's a thing that Scottish monarchs do. They go to war with England, and it's a thing that the subjects buy into. Surprisingly, after quite a lot of defeats, but there you go. And I mean, and in terms of domestic politics, I mean, he does have great authority, James. He does handle the domestic aspects of kingship pretty effectively, I think. And I think it's partly that just that charisma, the fact that his subjects don't want to dispute with him, don't want to fall out with him. He gets that sort of quite impressive buy-in to his policies, even though sometimes they're cynical and manipulative, and he utilizes the church in quite a cynical way, and he raises taxes in a variety of ways that might not always be immediately popular, but he's sort of got that gift of being able to carry the political community along with him, I think.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we'll draw a line under it there, just to let Ali go away and get his tea. So we can give Ali thanks again for a really interesting talk. More hand clapping. Thank you all very much for coming. Just a note that our next seminar of interest, hopefully, is on Thursday the 25th of March at 5:30. Dr. David Wilson from the University of Strathclyde will be talking about a war against pirates, suppressing piracy in Atlantic localities, 1716 to 1726. But otherwise, thank you all very much for coming. It's great to see so many of you here, and hopefully we'll look forward to seeing you next time out. But otherwise, good night, and thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much for coming along, folks.
Cheers again, Ali.
All right, cheers.